Well, we have to talk about how the federal government is doing something, or rather not doing something, that is going to greatly affect the car market. But before we get in this video, as always, if you're going to save time and money the next time you purchase a car, link to my car buying guide in the description down below. And then if you want to see more videos just like this, then I recommend you subscribe because I post content every single day. Let's get into it. So what is this thing that the federal government is doing, or rather not doing, that is going to greatly affect the car market? Well, it pertains to Section 179 in the tax code. This Section 179 allows business owners to deduct expenses that basically have depreciation associated with them. So equipment, vehicles, and even software. Like, we live in a world where businesses are able to write off software as a depreciating asset. And under the current code, businesses can literally deduct over $1 million per year, $1,050,000 to be exact. And the cool thing about how Section 179 functions not currently actually, because it just changed in 2023 and we'll talk about that, but how it did function over the last few years is that businesses were able to take all of this depreciation up front. They didn't have to do it over the course of several years, which is what businesses had to do in the past. And so let's talk about what this allowed businesses to do. So because businesses could literally depreciate the entirety of an item off in the first year rather than having to schedule it out over several years, it allowed businesses to make more purchases more often because, well, frankly, they could get bigger write-offs and they could justify everything. I mean, imagine that you are a business owner, and because of what we had in the tax code, you could go and buy an item and write off the entire item and completely lower your tax basis. Would you do it? Well, chances are you would. And this is what a lot of business owners have done over the last few years. And frankly, this is what I have done. This is why I have purchased so many vehicles on the channel. Like, at the end of every single year, I will look at where I'm at, in terms of the tax bracket situation. And if I see that I can purchase a vehicle that makes sense for the channel before the year ends and put myself into a lower tax bracket because of Section 179, then I will do it every single time. Because first off, I'll get a vehicle that I can use for the channel that'll allow me to make some content, and then I'll get that big tax deduction, again, 100% of the vehicle depreciated in 1 year. And so it's like a win-win all over the place. And so with how things have been structured currently, it's been really good, especially for small businesses, because again, the maximum deduction is just over $1 million. And most small businesses don't have that much in terms of total deductions. The businesses that do actually exceed that amount are obviously, the big corporations and everything. And so these changes actually hurt small businesses more than they hurt corporations. And let's get into the changes. So we've actually known about the changes that are coming to Section 179 for a few years, but obviously these changes could have been, pushed down the road a little bit, especially considering everything that's happening in the economy, but it looks like that's not going to happen. So what is basically going to happen is the ability to depreciate 100% of an item upfront is no longer going to happen. This is called bonus depreciation, and so what's going to happen is, first off, in 2023, you'll only be able to take 80% in terms of bonus depreciation, and then in 2024, 60%. And it's going to continue to drop down by 20% until by 2027, there will be no more bonus depreciation. And so if you want to write off an item as a business owner that qualifies under Section 179, then that means that you're just going to have to depreciate it over the course of several years. And this is what businesses had to do in the past. And so this is going to completely restructure how businesses make purchases, because, well, if you can depreciate 100% of an item in the first year that you purchase that item, that means that you can make more quote unquote impulse business buys, right? And this is what a lot of business owners have been doing at the end of every single year over the last few years, is they basically get to the end of the year and then they see how much money they made and they go, oh, well, I want to get a bigger deduction, so time to go and buy some stuff for the business so that I can get in a different tax bracket. Whereas if you can only depreciate part of an item, that means that, well, you're most likely going to plan way in advance with purchasing that item, and it's not going to be an item to buy just so that you can get a deduction, right? It's going to be an item to buy to actually use for business, because you're going to have to keep it for several years to actually get any benefit out of the tax deduction with that item. And so it's just going to change buying dynamics with businesses quite a bit. Now, there are some pros and cons that I see to this whole situation, and I want to put a quick disclaimer here. I am not a tax expert. I read into Section 179, I read into the updates that are happening here, and like, I happen to have a small business myself, and so that's where this is coming from. I'm not a tax expert, so correct me if I make any mistakes in this section. So when it comes to pros for this, I think that all of the pros apply to, frankly, the federal government, and that's it. I don't think there's any pro for like a regular person, because what it looks like is this is just the federal government cracking down on businesses. And I mean, I shouldn't say that again. This was kind of like a relief from the norm, and now we're going, back to the norm, but it's going back to the norm in a time that's not exactly ideal. We'll talk about that towards the end of the video. But anyways, I guess that, the federal government thinks that businesses are going to make less like fake purchases. And what I mean by that is that since you can't deduct 100% of an item in 1 year, well, then businesses aren't going to go and buy a bunch of random stuff at the end of the year like what they do now to get, a big deduction, because, well, they won't be able to do that anymore. They'll have to keep the item for several years and, actually, use it for business use. Obviously, businesses will still just buy stuff to buy stuff. Like, that's always going to happen. And so I'm sure that this might somewhat minimize that, but it won't minimize it as much as the federal government thinks. And then the other thing is, obviously, this is in hopes to raise more tax revenue, but, and this is just coming from the research that I've done, I don't think that that's going to be reality, because I think what's going to happen is this is actually going to push businesses to just make fewer purchases, which means that everyone in total is going to be making less money, because if you have businesses making fewer purchases, then the businesses they normally purchase from are going to be making less money, which means they're going to be paying less in tax dollars, which means the federal government is not actually going to get any more tax revenue from this whole situation. So yeah, those are the pros. But anyways, diving into the cons, and that's kind of the first con, is I think this ultimately will actually lead to some more economic slowdown in all segments. And don't worry, I'll relate this back to the whole vehicle world in just a moment. But I mean, you can imagine, especially with small businesses, like if you can no longer get a big deduction at the end of the year, then you're going to be a lot more careful with the items that you purchase. And you're going to make sure that you really, really need those items, which means you're just going to be purchasing less stuff in general. And I will use myself as an example. I have bought so many vehicles over the last few years, and it's because I've been able to take advantage of how Section 179 has been structured over the last few years. Now that it is being restructured, I'm actually going to pull back substantially, because now it's like, okay, well, the only way for me to get a big deduction from this vehicle is if I keep it long term. And a lot of the vehicles I don't really feel the need to keep long term, because it doesn't make sense on the channel. Now, yes, with the vehicles that I'm going to be selling in 3 to 6 months, this whole thing doesn't matter. But the vehicles that I keep for maybe a year or 2 years, that's where things are going to matter quite a bit, because I'm keeping them for long enough that there's going to be some level of deduction, but I'm also not going to be keeping them for long enough to get the total deduction. And so it's going to be a situation where the vehicle is really going to have to make sense, which means that I'm going to be purchasing less vehicles, which means the dealers that I normally purchase vehicles from are going to be selling less cars, which means they're going to be earning less revenue. You guys get the point, right? Just extrapolate that out throughout the entire economy with every single item that businesses buy, and I think that you guys can get the picture. And so, again, from my uneducated position of reading Section 179 and being a business owner, I think that this whole change ultimately is going to lead to less buying by businesses, which is going to lead to less economic growth overall, which ultimately will probably lead to, well, less tax revenue for the government. And so it probably is going completely against what they are trying to accomplish. How the heck does this even relate to the car market? Well, if you don't already know, there is a huge push at the end of every single year by automakers and by dealers to convince business owners to purchase vehicles because of how Section 179 has been structured. And this has been a pretty great deal for all parties, because business owners have been able to get great tax write-offs, and then automakers and dealers have been able to meet their end of the year goals because of this influx in business owners that are looking for a tax write-off. It's a huge thing. I mean, I literally purchased 2 cars in December because of this. Now, it's still going to be there. Like, business owners are always still going to purchase cars at the end of the year, no matter, how the deductions are structured. But there isn't going to be as many of those like impulse purchases, because again, this is going to be a deduction that has to be taken over the course of several years rather than over the course of just 1 year because of bonus depreciation. And so that means that there's just going to be less buying demand in the market with both new cars and used cars. And I see this not only affecting it because of those impulse buys, but also if you're in a situation where you're only going to get a deduction on an item that you're buying for your business over the course of several years, and you can't deduct the item completely up front, Well, that means that you're probably not going to get rid of the item until you absolutely need to. Like, because of how this has been structured, a lot of businesses have been purchasing new vehicles every single year, not because they actually need to get new vehicles for their business, but because they want to continue to get that big deduction every single year. That is going to go away. Businesses are going to go back to the practice of buying vehicles and buying items that qualify under Section 179 and using them until they are completely destroyed. And some of you might like that, but what you have to understand is that is less purchases happening, which means less stimulation in the economy. And again, I'm no economic expert, but like, I feel like you put 2 and 2 together and it makes sense, right? That it's just not going to be a good situation overall. And the next outcome of this is going to be a situation where a lot of businesses might be underwater on vehicles that they purchase. And here's what I mean. So with how Section 179 is structured right now, or how it was structured rather, businesses were incentivized to pay cash for vehicles. Because if you write off 100% of a vehicle in the first year, you do not want to have a loan on that. Because let's say that you have to sell that vehicle for some reason because business just isn't good anymore. Well, if you have a loan on that vehicle, you have to basically go and pay off that loan once you sell the vehicle, but you also have to recapture the taxes that you just wrote off on that vehicle. And so let's say that your vehicle has lost a lot of value, and so you're now upside down in the loan where you owe more in the loan than what the vehicle's worth. Well, you put yourself in a really bad situation from a business perspective because you'll go and sell the vehicle, and then the money that you would have normally used to try to pay off part of the loan, and then you have to take out more money to pay off the rest of the loan, has to actually go towards paying taxes. So that's why it never makes sense for businesses to pay or to take out a loan on an item if they're going to write off the entire item. Well, now that you won't be able to write off an entire item like a vehicle in the first year, that means that businesses will actually be incentivized to take out loans, because why would you front the cash for a purchase if you're only going to be able to write off part of that purchase in the first year? Because, well, the rest of the cash that you're fronting is not tax deductible that year. It's going to be tax deductible in future years. So you're going to want to keep that cash on hand so that you can pay taxes and, frankly, put down payments on other items that you're going to be buying for the business. And so this is basically going to lead to a lot more auto loan purchases within the business world, which will ultimately put a lot of businesses in a situation where they'll probably be upside down in their vehicles, depending on, you know, how much deduction they're able to get and how much money they're putting down on these vehicles, which you don't want an industry full of people that are upside down, because that means that people that would normally trade in a vehicle are no longer able to trade in that vehicle, which means that supply goes down and it messes up the entire market. So I know this video is kind of all over the place, but the tax system is super complex. That's why we all have accountants to do our taxes for us. If it was easy, well, accountants would be completely out of a job. And so here's the deal with this whole situation. What ultimately is going to happen is not a lot in the short term, right? Because the deductions are still pretty big. But as the deductions dwindle, businesses are going to change how they purchase items like vehicles. And when it comes to the vehicle market, this is going to put a lot of downward pressure on the vehicle market. Now, I couldn't find an exact number in terms of how many vehicles businesses purchase per year, but out of the, you know, roughly 40 million used cars that are purchased per year and the 14 million new cars that are purchased each year, with where numbers are at currently, I think it'd be pretty safe to assume that not, you know, the entire portion of those vehicles are purchased by businesses, but a large portion, because you got to remember, a lot of vehicles are purchased by small businesses that might only purchase 1 or 2 vehicles per year, but there's a lot of small businesses here in the US, and so you add that up over the course of all of the small businesses, and it adds up to a pretty substantial number. And so if you have a pullback by small businesses, because they're ultimately the ones that get impacted by this the most, well, it's definitely going to affect the overall car market. So it's going to bring prices down, which a lot of you might be saying, hooray, car prices are going to come down even more. And I see that as a benefit for those of you that have been waiting for lower car prices. Again, this is going to take years to fully, you know, iron out within the car market. But I also, again, see this as a downside overall for the economy, because I mean, again, businesses will always purchase items for their business, but this is going to push businesses, especially small businesses that benefited from this tax change the most, to be a lot more careful with the items that they purchase. And, you know, again, they're going to have to think ahead with purchases. There's a lot of changes that will happen that, again, I'm not an economic expert, but 2 + 2 = 4, and I think that if you can't get a big deduction off of an item, then you're probably not going to convince yourself to purchase it unless you absolutely need it, which just, again, like I said earlier in the video, leads to less stimulant, what am I saying? Less stimulus in the economy, whatever word I'm looking for. I'm completely worn out of this video, but that's going to sum things up. Let me know what you guys think about this whole situation and what you think is going to happen with these changes. I mean, do you think that it's just going to be business as usual? I think it will be for the big businesses, but I think that small businesses, they're the ones that it's probably not going to be business as usual. Anyways,